Mining.com has become one of the most go-to, most visited mining websites in the world. Covers global mining news and has upwards of over 400,000 unique visitors a month. So Frik's been there for 9 years, has done an incredible job building up the content and the following of that. I'll introduce Frik. You come on up and introduce your panel.
Good afternoon. Battery metals is a fast-changing, young, and complex supply chain and industry. So I asked Andrew Miller of Benchmark Mineral Intelligence to give us a short introduction and just give us a lay of the land of where we are. And then afterwards, I'll call the panel and we'll continue the discussion.
Hi there, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Frik, for the introduction, and thank you for all the team for putting on the event today. As Frik said, I've been asked to give a few introductory remarks. I know we're running a little bit behind time, so I'll try and be brief with these remarks. But I just wanted to give a snapshot and an overview of what we see as the developments in the lithium-ion battery supply chain and what's really key to look out for as you look at this market going forward. A brief bit about Benchmark and what we do for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We're a market-based publishing company. We specialize in the lithium-ion battery supply chain. And really what we aim to do is tie together what's happening at a raw material level and follow that through to the anodes and cathodes and battery cell production to encapsulate the whole EV supply chain. We have a number of different divisions of our business that can help from everything from pricing, forecasting, events, consultancy. So if you'd like to know any more about any of that, please feel free to come and have a chat after the panel today. I wanted to set the scene a little bit by taking a step back and looking at the macro picture for electric vehicles and for the lithium-ion battery market. When we started Benchmark back in 2015, there were 3 of what have become known as the battery mega factories. So these are lithium-ion battery production facilities with a capacity pretty much an order of magnitude bigger than anything that was previously in the market prior to 2015. The big one, pretty much, I'm sure everyone in the room would have heard about, is obviously the Tesla Gigafactory. There are also 2 other gigawatt-hour scale facilities in the pipeline at that point, one of which never actually came to fruition, which was Foxconn. If you contrast that to where we are today, we're now up to 99 of these megafactories, Tesla no longer being the largest by quite some way. A few of these logos on the screen here you'll recognize, maybe potentially BYD, obviously some of the more established players in the market, Panasonic, Samsung, those type of companies. But you've also seen a huge wave of new companies enter this market, a lot based in China, in Asia, which is really the lithium-ion battery production hub, but some companies as well that have started to develop the industry outside of Asia. Northvolt, for instance. Obviously, we have the Gigafactory in North America and other Asian companies that have invested in parts of North America to develop production capacity outside of Asia. So a much more global trend than it ever was back in 2015 and a huge amount of change over the past 4 years. So where does that take us and what does the industry look like today? If you look at the lithium-ion battery market last year, to give you some context, there was less than 300 gigawatt hours of installed capacity globally last year for lithium-ion batteries. So we're working from a base of around 300 gigawatt hours last year. That number, with the 99 plants really driving things forward that I mentioned before, is taking things to over 2 terawatt hours. So over 2,000 gigawatt hours is now in the pipeline for lithium-ion battery production capacity by 2028. So a huge amount of change over the coming decade. What you'll also notice, and why I put it at the top there, is really this trend isn't slowing down. As we've sort of seen, a lot of these raw material markets for batteries really slow over the past 12 months. This year, you've continued to see major announcements, major investments being made downstream, both at an electric vehicle level and a battery cell level. Just at the start of this year, we're only at around 1,500 gigawatt hours, which is still huge. We've added around a third to that from where we are today. So while the rest of the supply chain maybe isn't moving at the same pace as what's happening downstream, it's worth keeping track of where this market is really going longer term. And what does that mean for the raw materials then? What does that mean for the mining and what's happening upstream in this supply chain? What I've done is taken those numbers, those total numbers of all of this capacity that's in the pipeline over the coming decade, and tried to give you some context about what we see as the 4 critical raw materials in this supply chain and what it means for the growth of those industries over the coming decade. So if all of those mega factories were due to come into production and operate at full capacity, we know that's most likely not the case, but we're still a decade out from this 2028 sort of time horizon. You'd see that the graphite usage, graphite anode use in lithium-ion batteries will grow from around 180,000 tonnes last year to over 2 million tonnes by 2028. That is where the demand will go to supply that amount of lithium-ion battery capacity. Lithium, very similar growth, 10x growth. You're looking at a market that was supplying 120,000 tonnes of a total around 300,000 tonne market. Around 120 was going into batteries last year. That's growing to 1.6 million. Similarly for nickel, 82,000 tonnes, a much smaller, a very small fragment of the total nickel market was going into lithium-ion batteries. That will grow to 1.3 million tonnes to support that. And cobalt going from 61,000 to just under 400,000. So the point is about all of these minerals and these markets is, with the slight exception of nickel, but not the nickel chemical that goes into batteries, you're talking about refined speciality minerals and metals. These aren't big bulk commodities where it's just a matter of taking them out of the ground and shipping them to the end market. These have to be refined, typically into chemicals that are used by the battery producers. So we're not just talking about the mining side of this, we're talking about advanced materials that are going to need to grow at a rate of 10x plus over the next 10 years. So huge growth coming from these battery production facilities. Then I suppose, as we're all aware, not all of these will come to fruition. A lot are in China. A lot maybe don't have completely secured investment to act on those expansion plans. But really to get a wider picture of where demand will be in the future, what we then do is look at, what is the actual material that these raw materials are used in? And that's the anode and cathode. That's predominantly where the technology developments in the lithium-ion battery market are happening, either on the anode or the cathode side. If you look at the outlook, and this shows you the sort of range of different cathode technologies in the market, you'll see there's a number of different types of chemistry that are available for lithium-ion batteries on the cathode side. But the key point I really want to point out here is that we're moving from that dark blue area, which is where the market was in 2015. That represents LCO. So that's the type of cathode chemistry that you'll get in your smartphones, in your laptops, consumer electronics. Very cobalt intensive, that material, but obviously not as much growth in that part of the market. If you look forward and where we're going in the future, really the bulk of growth in the lithium-ion battery market is of course going to be driven by the emergence of electric vehicles, and in particular the adoption of passenger electric vehicles. The grey areas at the top represent what the industry knows as NCA or NMC cathodes. The important thing to note about those is those are cathode chemistries which require a huge amount of nickel, a much higher nickel intensity. So there's big security of supply issues around nickel chemicals for batteries. But also you're going to see a huge amount of growth. And even though the intensity of cobalt is going to decrease compared to the LCO technology, you're actually going to see a huge amount of volume increase in cobalt in the market moving forward. So those grey areas, nickel and cobalt-based cathode chemistries, are really where we're headed towards. On the anode side, it's a little bit more cut and dry. You're typically looking either natural or synthetic graphite on that side of the market. But again, the key point about this graphite, and while graphite as a wider market might be a little bit more akin to some of big bulk commodities, the key point about this is the type of graphite that's used in batteries isn't the most available, either from a feedstock point of view or from the engineering that has to take place to take that raw material to something that can be used by battery producers. So this is the development on the anode side, and really it's that type of carbon, the natural, the synthetic carbon, which is really going to dominate the market for the foreseeable future. So I know we want to open this up to panel, and I won't take I won't take too much longer of your time. I just wanted to finish off on this, and this is our forecast. So I've given you the case study of what if all of these production facilities come into come to fruition. Of course, that might not be the case, but we're still expected, and this grey line here shows our growth projection for each of these key raw materials. And the key point that I really want to point out here is that if you look at the expected supply growth from existing operations in the market, in the case of lithium, you're looking around 2022. Even with those expansions that are lined up from existing operations, if you were to just rely on those, the market would be moving into deficit by 2022. You need some new supply to come into the market, or else the lithium industry is going to be faced with a huge bottleneck in the adoption of these electric vehicles. The other key point about this is by that 2022 time horizon, to bring a new lithium operation, to get it into production, to ramp it up, to get the spec of lithium required by battery users, there's a huge qualification process in this too. So to start addressing some of that potential deficit from 2022, the money needs to start going into lithium now, or yesterday really, but it needs to definitely be going in now. And then looking even further forward than that, if you look at lithium and you take into account all of the new projects, all of the projects that are being developed at the moment, and you account that all of those are going to get the financing they need, they're going to come into production in this time frame, you're still looking at 2027 that the market moves into deficit again. So this is a huge structural change for the lithium industry and for all of these raw materials that needs to be addressed by significant investment and partnerships between the mining industry and the EV companies and battery companies further downstream. And just to wrap things up, Cobalt, very similar picture. Actually, Cobalt, due to Glencore's announcement just a few weeks ago, the Cobalt market looks set to move into deficit as early as next year and a structural deficit by 2026. Similar picture for flake graphite, 2022. And then even if you were to take into account all of the development stage projects, we're facing a big challenge by 2028. So I'll wrap up with this and just a final slide that might be of interest to some of you in the room, given where we are. This is how we sort of explain to the lithium-ion battery supply chain to people when they ask us where are the key areas of this supply chain. We have the mining, we then have the chemical processing, which takes those materials into something battery users could actually use. You then have the cell manufacturing, the anode or cathode production, the cell manufacturing, and that's all before it can go into these electric vehicles, these Teslas, all of these new models that are being introduced. The key point to point out from this slide is that China is the only country that dominates every level of this supply chain. And there is very limited, if not no production here in Canada at this stage. And I know we're going to hear from a couple of companies on the panel who are looking to put that right. So I'll finish up with that, and then hopefully you can move into a discussion. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. I'd like to invite on stage Trent Mell. He's President, CEO, and Director of First Cobalt. Guy Bourassa, he is President and CEO of Nemaska Lithium. And Ryan Castilloux is MD of Adamas Intelligence. So I was an automotive journalist in a previous life, so the fact that the two industries are colliding is great news for me. I think my first, I'll let Ryan speak first. Your company literally operates where the rubber meets the road, right?
Yeah. Test. Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. We are a market research and consulting company. We cover the rare earth industry quite closely, which is, I think, what we're most known for. But we also closely track global EV registrations month after month and follow what's happening with the chemistries being used in those EVs and what the implications are for metals consumption.
Thanks. I think next, Guy, tell us a bit about Nemaska Lithium.
Well, Nemaska Lithium is a Quebec-based company that has been working since the fall of 2009 in developing a vertically integrated lithium hydroxide production facility in Quebec. So the mine up north, as you see this picture, taken about a month ago. We're in the construction phase of the mine operation, and we'll also have a conversion facility in Shawinigan, Quebec. We have developed we wanted to become vertically integrated to be able to compete with the Chinese, get a better quality product, cheaper, but also greener. with very little byproduct so that we can take advantage of this. At some point, if you are to go in the EV industry, might as well be green yourself to put that thing on the market. So we developed a new process, electrochemical process for making lithium lithium salt splitting. And we have built in 2017 and have operated for 3 years now a phase 1 plant, so a demonstration plant, to qualify our product with the clients and also demonstrate clearly the quality of the product. We're in the construction phase currently, and hopefully we'll be able to wrap it up by the end of the year, next year.
Trent.
Yeah, so first Cobalt, we started this company a couple of years ago. Initially went to the DRC because that's where Cobalt is. That's where, we're coming up to 70% of global production coming out of the Congo. Meanwhile, the battery market continues to evolve. The epicenter today is Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. The U.S., and I think these are benchmark charts, I think, Andy, at least the one on the right. The U.S. is coming up to being the second largest battery maker, battery jurisdiction in the world, and yet we don't have any cobalt here. We got no production, we got no downstream processing, and so our assets are Canada, U.S., on the mineral side, and on the processing side, we've got a refinery 5 hours north of here in Cobalt, Ontario, and that's really been the focus of our attention over the last year or so, particularly as Cobalt kind of went through a bit of a down trough in 2018. And so where we are right now, we've announced a deal with Glencore to put $40 million into the refinery to recommission it, to expand it, initially taking feed out of the DRC. That feed right now is finding its way from the DRC into China. And so in addition to the artisanal issues that we're all too aware of in Africa, and particularly in the Congo, you've got the geopolitical backdrop of Chinese control of rare earths and now critical minerals. I've been to the White House a couple of times to discuss this issue. Interior Department, DC, is very tuned in to the cobalt market. And so our opportunity really is to become the first and only processor or refiner of cobalt here on the continent. And so our refinery, you'll see a picture here if we could scroll through a couple of slides. One more, I'll come back to there it is. So we're junior, we got a 60 million market cap, and yet we've got this building here that the replacement value is worth well more than our market cap. But this image, what it captures is the infrastructure is there, the building is there, the roads, the tailing facility, the power. And when you think of project execution, this is where things go off the rails, timing and budget, and it's all there. And so the work we're going to be doing is inside the four walls. And more important than all that is it's permitted. And so our opportunity here is to get ourselves into production for next year with the world's biggest cobalt miner supplying the feed and the capital, and thereafter looking to expand it. And the last slide of this deck, we won't go to it, but there's the footprint that expands the inside. And here we go. If we realize on our objectives here, and this is a forward-looking statement, we would account for about 5% of the global refining market right here in North America. So a good start for a problem that governments around the world are trying to solve.
Thank you. Speaking of the DRC, and I guess cobalt is at the forefront of this trend. I remember rare earths 10 years ago when prices were going stratospheric. There was lots of talk, and China controlled more than 90% of all output, if not virtually all of it. There was lots of talk of having legislation limiting or encouraging places like the US to be less dependent on China. Of course, we know what happened. 8 years later, the only rare earth mine in the US went into receivership. Is there finally, I know there's new legislation being tabled as well, and there's more initiatives afoot. Is that finally happening? Are we seeing that politicians and the structure of the system is taking this seriously?
Maybe I'll start if I could. It's a problem in search of a solution, and the politicians are, they're actively turning their mind to it. We got a trade war that's front and center of everybody's mind in the global economy. They just don't know what to do about it. There's legislation that's coming that's saying we're going to make it easier, but so what? Until we see it, we've got patented property in Idaho, but we're surrounded by Forest Service lands, and you're dealing with civil servants. And you can do everything right, but you can't get certainty of a permitting process when you're dealing with the federal jurisdiction. It can't be a 1 year or 2 year. It could be a 3 or a 5 or a never. So we've got the benefit of having private land, but when you look at how you're going to kind of remove the log jam here, it's two things. It's permitting, and of course it's access to capital. Now there is talk with some of these cooperation agreements, US and Australia, Canada, Brazil, Chile, about maybe using part of the US defense budget to develop the downstream processing side of things. it would be nice. But those are the two things you need. And I'm not sure the politicians, beyond a lot of goodwill and a lot of good statements, really have the answers that we need to move this forward.
Yeah, but the problem with the politicians is that they're elected for 4 years. Developing a mine takes 10 years. So you have to have that vision and have, after that, the money available, the will to do it. Just give you an example. You talked about the rare earth. Rare earth is controlled by the Chinese because they have the benefit of having the rare earth on their soil. It is not the case in lithium. In lithium, they're dependent on importing the raw material from elsewhere, in this case, Australia. So they don't have that structure that can give them the control. We're letting them take the control.
Right.
They have bought big mines in Australia. They have bought a big chunk of SQM shares. They are trying to corner small producers everywhere. If we let them do that, and we do let them do that because we do not provide capital to other companies to be able to develop. I was just going to give an example. Our project, we raised $1.1 billion last year that we closed in May. Of the $1.1 billion, 10% or 12% came from the Quebec government. The rest of it, less than 10%, came from Canada, including retail investors, etc. So how can you try to keep the control or get the control or not allow China to get the control if you're not willing to put money where your mouth is?
Yes.
That's one of the issues.
Yeah, and if I can, I think I have a failing battery in this microphone. If I can just add, I agree with both Trent and with Guy for the most part, what they said. Coming from the rare earth side of things, which, as I mentioned, is what we primarily focus on, I'm always encouraged to see these type of government mandates come about, but I'm always skeptical about, what results can really be born out of it. On the rare earth side, what we often see is a focus on cutting red tape. How can we expedite the development of new mines, get new holes in the ground in the US or in allied countries so that we can get that domestic supply? And the challenge is often that there's a failure to recognize these gaps downstream of that mine output that will take, be it the rare earth mine outputs and turn them into magnets, or take the lithium or nickel mine outputs, turn them into chemicals, cathodes, anodes, etc. So until these downstream pieces of the puzzle are addressed and filled in, I think any efforts that are directed at bringing about new mines or new sources of supply will simply be misguided and ultimately may just end up resulting in more output that gets sent to China or sent elsewhere to be value added, to be processed. So the key, in our view, really needs to be on focusing these midstream gaps that will take those mine outputs and make them usable for the domestic end users, the automakers, the wind turbine manufacturers, et cetera.
If it's not coming from governments or similar initiatives, may it come from the consumer? We heard about the little green line that Apple wants to have between them and where the metals in their phones come from. Aren't we going to see a point where somebody is going to make a blood cobalt movie and that whole pendulum is going to swing? And that you can envisage a period where maybe there's a premium to be paid for cobalt from North America or Europe.
I think Trent may have some comments on the cobalts. I think you're definitely going to start to see. I don't know whether you can shift completely away from, particularly in the case of cobalt, DRC is so central as a source of raw material, to move away. But to place a premium on a strategically located supply chain, I think is definitely the way the industry is moving. And you've seen that from a number of years ago when I suppose the Amnesty report a few years ago shone a lot of light on what was happening on cobalt and made people like Apple very uncomfortable. But we're not talking about Apple now. We're not talking about batteries the size of your phone anymore. We're talking about batteries the size of your car. So it's the GMs of the world, it's the Fords, everyone who's put out these huge statements, the VWs about where they want to be in the future. They don't want to, just from a sensible business practice point of view, they don't want to see the vast majority of their batteries, their anodes, their cathodes, their raw materials coming out of China. So I sort of agree with Ryan, definitely in the sense, and I think we're starting to already see it. A lot of this drive needs to come from developing the whole supply chain. The raw materials are a very central part to that. But if the market's still in Asia, you're not solving a huge problem potentially. What will be really important, I think, moving forward, and why Trent's projects and Guy's project are really strategically important to North America as a whole, is that to support the automotive industry here, to support the continued development of the automotive industry, the supply chain needs to be in place to allow for electric vehicles. And for that reason, I do think, though, there's the potential that you'll see a premium and that you'll see companies want to work with specific other companies for their supply chain.
I just got back from Asia, a trade mission with NRCan, myself, with 15 other resource companies, trying to pair up sort of battery minerals companies in Canada with some of the big conglomerates in Asia, and it is coming. The battery plant investment, the cathode makers, the battery makers, to support the evolution of the EV market here in North America. These are big investments, billion-dollar investments. We've got a lithium producer, cobalt producer here in North America that could support that. Quebec, Ontario, Alabama, Georgia, they're all vying to attract those dollars. And these are big, big dollars. So maybe we will have our moment. The EV market for some still feels like a cute, cool, niche-y little industry. But if you look at the adoption rate of any technology through time, the automotive industry is a great example. The year 1900, the U.S. had 8,000 automotive licenses. 12 years later, 8,000 becomes 902,000 licenses. So it goes from being niche to mainstream. And we're on that curve. A lot of people don't see it yet. We're barely at the early adopters stage, but it's coming, and it's coming in a huge, huge fashion. And it's going to be very exciting for our industry and what it means, not just for the niche little commodities you see here, but copper and nickel alike.
So just on the theme of tech, WeWork was mentioned this morning. Last year I did a battery metals presentation where I mentioned a dog walking app. And the reason I'm saying that is, Guy, your company shares investors in those companies. Is this maybe where the tide turns, where big VC companies in the tech space see where they need to go?
I don't know if it's the reality or it's somebody that has seeing in the future. I thought that the money would come from OEM car manufacturers or large battery manufacturers. Unfortunately, OEM car manufacturers have not yet realized that it takes at least 10 years to develop from the ground up a new supply chain of raw material. Battery manufacturers are not there yet. I thought that the money would, and it's big money, very big money. So with small market cap, $200 million, $400 million of market cap, you need $1 billion. It's a big, big chunk. Yeah. So it's very challenging. That's why, and again, it's a circle. You talk with some bankers and you try to finance your project, and they say, well, Guy, it's $1 billion, it's too much. Why don't you start as a spodumene producer and sell to the Chinese? And with the profit at some point, maybe you will be able to finance, so less dilution. You try to explain to them, makes no sense. And the reality just catching up. There was a big spike in the concentrate sales price 2 years ago. Now it's down to about cost of production in Australia. So obviously, anybody in Canada that would have a business plan of making spodumene concentrate would be closed. Yeah. So you have to have a vision, you have to have a plan, and you need to execute the plan no matter what sideliners say. But getting the money, I don't think the VCs are, because they have a short-term vision of return where you have a long-term investment. So end users should be the one that are investing in that.
Yeah, and I mean, like you say, the numbers are staggering. I mean, Volkswagen alone announced a $50 billion battery purchasing plan. And if you look at electric vehicles versus internal combustion engines, the raw materials almost makes up half of the cost of the vehicle versus internal combustion, that's maybe 12, and that's steel and aluminum maybe. So both industries, I think, will be fundamentally changed by this. Which brings me to my next question. It is evolving so rapidly. It's quite complex. What are possible investors in this sector may be missing?
Yeah, just a quick thought. This is something I thought about in advance because I think it is a question that begs a thoughtful answer. I think when you look at the EV space and you see how fast it's growing, and you look at the battery space and you recognize how quickly it's evolving, how different materials are being used in different quantities and other materials are being thrifted, et cetera, that can be off-putting, I think, as from an investor's standpoint on the outside looking in. But when you consider the underlying growth when you discount the changes in chemistries that we're seeing now and into the future, you consider the underlying growth that's going to push this demand up, be it EV sales, in combination with rising average pack capacity, so an average EV having a larger battery. We're going to see a situation where a rising tide floats all boats. So recognizing that we're moving towards cathode chemistries that have higher concentrations of nickel at the expense of cobalt doesn't make it an either-or situation. We think that all of the materials that are used in the chemistries currently are going to enjoy this growth going forward. And I think in looking at the slide that Andrew put up with projections of cathode chemistries into the foreseeable future, we see that there's no major surprises coming. We don't have new fandangled technologies coming in the next decade or two, meaning that it's going to be nickel, it's going to be lithium, it's going to be cobalt, graphite, and manganese. Some may do better than others, but ultimately a rising tide is going to float all of those boats.
Yeah, to answer your question, the investors are missing intelligence. I mean, information. Because if anybody was looking a close look at Andrew's slide, where you have a shortage in 2022, a shortage in 2027, even taking into consideration all projects, and I can guarantee you if we go projects by projects, half of it don't even make the bar. Yeah. So if you look at this, you would always all be gone out calling your brokers to buy stocks of lithium and cobalt. Yeah. So you need intelligence, you need information. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of good available, free information available to understand what's coming. So people are looking at the big titles. Everything coming back to the Chinese spot market or the Chinese EV. Subsidy in June has been changed, reducing the penetration of EV. So, there's no more lithium needed. Mm-hmm. So you need to have good intelligence, take the time, and if you do believe what Andrew is saying, run and buy your lithium stocks.
I would add there's three things investors are missing. Andy can speak to the cost component better than any of us in terms of the cost parity between EVs and gas engines, and it's coming down at a rapid pace, and we're getting close. So cost parity is going to be a big, important differentiator. But the investments that are going in, $50 billion by VW alone, it's massive. We're not going back. This is not a fad that's going to come and go. So you got to take the view that it's here to stay. And thirdly, if you've driven an EV, I bought a Tesla 3 a couple of months ago. It's a superior ride. You're driving your phone. Everything is automated. Yes, there's the cool factor, but there's so much more about electric vehicles than just the battery. It's a smart car, and if you can get over the range anxiety and the cost factors and all that, then I think the adoption rates go through the roof.
Thank you.
And maybe I'll just finish with this. No, I'll let you, Andrew, continue. No?
Oh, no, you go ahead. Go ahead. I was just going to say, from our point of view, and coming back to Guy's point about intelligence, I think a big problem we find from investors that subscribe to our services is the lack of transparency, particularly on price. It makes it very difficult to value projects when these aren't, Guy and I were having a conversation about this earlier, trying to apply a commodity framework to these type of minerals and metals, it doesn't work. People are asking, what is the price of lithium? There's not one price of lithium. There are dozens of prices of lithium, dozens different types of lithium that go into a battery. Similar issue with cobalt and all of these, what we see as the critical battery inputs. So I'd say that's a big hurdle that the industry needs to overcome and investors need to get their head around at the same time.
Yeah, and I was going to say the Chinese, or people are thinking that the Chinese can, like this, increase their production and conversion of lithium salt, and they're going to flood the market. Again, understand the cost structure. They are dependent on importing the raw material from third parties kilometers away, thousands of kilometers away. They cannot flood the market at a cheap cost. They have a base cost that is higher than what we can do in Canada. But more important, they are not reliable. They do lie about their capacity. They never get to their nameplate capacity. And they very, very rarely get to the quality that is required by the rest of the world battery manufacturers. So when you look and you say only LCE numbers in general, and you mix all of this together, you don't consider quality and product, and you just have a big number, which is inflated artificially by the Chinese that are building the conversion facility, maybe you can say, there's going to be an oversupply. But when you do your real job, and you do analysis, and you follow the last 35 years of statistics about production in China, you know that they will never make their number.
The chance for maybe a couple of questions? Or?
Yeah, we're really, really kind of time. You want one quick one for the audience?
Sure.
Anyone from the audience?
Okay, sure. Thank you very much.
Must have been clear.